The morning sun painted golden streaks across the busy downtown street as people hurried to their destinations. Cars honked in the distance, and the familiar sounds of city life filled the air. It was one of those perfect Tuesday afternoons when everyone seemed to be in a rush, but the weather was just nice enough to make you forget about your worries for a moment. Dr. James walked down the sidewalk with his usual calm pace. At 45, he had learned that rushing rarely got you where you needed to go any faster. His brown leather bag hung comfortably over his shoulder, filled with student papers that needed grading and notes for his afternoon class. He taught history at the local university, and today was particularly special because he was about to give a lecture on something he was passionate about. The coffee shop on 5th Street was his regular stop. He had been coming here for almost 3 years now, ever since he started working at the university. The baristas knew his order by heart, and he enjoyed the friendly atmosphere. It was the kind of place where students studied, business people had meetings, and neighbors caught up on local news. As he approached the familiar glass doors, he could see through the windows that the lunch crowd had already arrived. The place was buzzing with activity. Office workers in suits stood in line checking their phones. College students sat at corner tables with laptops open, and the sound of the coffee machine created a comforting background noise that he had grown to love. James pushed open the door, and the smell of fresh coffee beans immediately hit him. It was that rich, warm scent that made everything feel right in the world. He nodded to Lisa, one of the baristas, who gave him a quick wave while she worked on someone else's order. The line was longer than usual, but he didn't mind. He had planned for this and had left his office early. Behind the counter, 3 baristas worked efficiently, calling out orders and steaming milk. The display case showed off fresh pastries and sandwiches, and the chalkboard menu listed the day's specials. In colorful handwriting, everything about this place felt welcoming and comfortable. James took his place at the end of the line, pulling out his phone to review his notes one more time. His afternoon lecture was about African civilizations and their contributions to world history. It was a topic that many of his students found surprising because their previous education had rarely covered it in detail. He loved seeing their faces light up when they learned about the great libraries of Timbuktu, or the advanced mathematics developed in ancient African kingdoms. The line moved slowly but steadily. In front of him, a young woman ordered an elaborate drink with multiple modifications, taking her time to explain exactly how she wanted it prepared. The barista listened patiently, writing everything down on the cup. This was normal for the lunch rush, and James used the time to mentally rehearse his lecture. He thought about his students and how engaged they had become in recent weeks. Teaching had always been more than just a job for him. It was a chance to open minds and share knowledge that could change how people saw the world. Every semester, he watched young people discover connections between past and present that they had never considered before. The woman in front of him finished her order and moved to the side to wait. James stepped forward, but before he could reach the counter, someone else entered the line behind him. He glanced back briefly and saw an older woman in an expensive-looking coat. She was probably in her 60s, with perfectly styled gray hair and jewelry that caught the light. She seemed agitated, checking her watch repeatedly and sighing loudly. James didn't think much of it. Everyone had bad days, and the lunch rush could be stressful for people who weren't used to waiting. He turned his attention back to the counter, where the barista was now ready for his order. The coffee shop continued its busy rhythm around them. Conversations blended together in a comfortable murmur, punctuated by the occasional laugh or the sound of chairs being moved. Near the window, 2 business partners discussed a presentation over their laptops. At a corner table, a group of college students debated something from their philosophy class. The atmosphere was exactly what James loved about this place. Diverse, energetic, and peaceful all at the same time. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting the strap of his leather bag. Inside were essays from his morning class about the Harlem Renaissance. His students had written thoughtful pieces about how art and literature had been used to challenge social barriers and create positive change. Reading their work always reminded him why he had chosen teaching as his career. The barista finished with the previous customer and looked up with a smile. James was next in line, and he was already thinking about his usual order, a medium coffee with just a splash of cream. It was simple, but it gave him the energy he needed for his afternoon classes. Behind him, the older woman's sighing grew more pronounced. She tapped her foot on the tile floor, creating a sharp clicking sound that cut through the ambient noise of the coffee shop. Other customers began to notice her impatience, and a few glanced in her direction with mild concern. James remained, focused on the positive energy of the place. This coffee shop represented everything he loved about his community, people from different backgrounds coming together in a shared space, each pursuing their own goals, but coexisting peacefully. It was a small example of how society could work when people treated each other with respect and consideration. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the large windows created a warm, inviting atmosphere. Plants hung from the ceiling, and local artwork decorated the walls. Everything about the space encouraged people to relax and connect with each other. It was exactly the kind of environment where meaningful conversations happened and lasting friendships were formed. As James prepared to step forward and place his order, he had no idea that the next few minutes would test everything he believed about human nature, dignity, and the power of education to bridge divides. The peaceful afternoon was about to become something entirely different, but in that moment, he was simply a teacher, looking forward to his coffee and his next class. James stepped up to the counter with his usual friendly demeanor. The barista, a young man named Alex, smiled and prepared to take his order. This was their routine, and Alex already knew what James would want, but he always waited politely for him to speak first. "Good afternoon," James said in his warm, clear voice. "Could I please have a medium coffee with just a splash of cream?" Alex nodded and started writing on the cup. "Absolutely, Professor. How's your day going?" "Very well, thank you," James replied. "Looking forward to my afternoon lecture." As Alex rang up the order, James reached for his wallet. The interaction was pleasant and normal, exactly like hundreds of similar exchanges he had had in this same spot. The coffee shop maintained its busy but comfortable atmosphere, with the usual sounds of conversation and coffee preparation creating a familiar backdrop. But behind him, something was building. The older woman who had been sighing and checking, her watch was growing more agitated by the minute. Her patience, which had been thin to begin with, was now completely gone. She watched James's polite interaction with the barista, and for reasons that would soon become clear, it seemed to irritate her even more. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "This line is moving like molasses." James heard the comment but didn't turn around. He had learned long ago that some people used complaining as a way to deal with stress, and he didn't take it personally. He focused on completing his transaction, pulling out a $5 bill to pay for his coffee. Alex took the money and went to the register to make change. This simple process, which normally took maybe 30 seconds, seemed to trigger something in the woman behind James. "Oh, for crying out loud," she said, much louder this time. "Some people need to learn how to move faster." Now other customers were definitely noticing. Conversations began to quiet down as people sensed tension building in the line. The woman's voice had an edge to it that made everyone uncomfortable. James accepted his change from Alex and smiled. "Thank you very much. Have a great day." But as he spoke, the woman behind him seemed to reach her breaking point. There was something about his voice, his polite manner, or perhaps just the fact that he existed in the same space as her that set her off completely. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "Do you think you could speak a little faster? Some of us have important places to be." James turned around, genuinely surprised by the direct confrontation. His face showed confusion rather than anger. In all his years of coming to this coffee shop, nothing like this had ever happened. "I'm sorry," he said politely. "I didn't realize I was holding up the line." But his reasonable response seemed to make her even angrier. Her face was flushed now, and her eyes had a look that made other customers take a step back. "You people," she said, her voice rising. "You people never do realize, do you?" The phrase hit the coffee shop like a thunderbolt. Conversation stopped completely. The baristas paused in their work. Even the coffee machine seemed to quiet down as if sensing the gravity of what was happening. James felt his stomach drop. He recognized the tone, the phrase, the look in her eyes. After 45 years of life and decades of studying history, he knew exactly where this was heading, but he hoped he was wrong. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," he said carefully, his voice still calm and respectful. The woman stepped closer, her expensive coat rustling as she moved. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at his chest. "You know exactly what I mean," she hissed. "People like you come into our country and slow everything down with your lazy attitudes and your broken English." The coffee shop fell into complete silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when something shocking and terrible occurs, and everyone needs a moment to process what they've just witnessed. James stood perfectly still. His mind raced through options, responses, ways to de-escalate the situation. In his classes, he taught about moments like this throughout history. He had read countless accounts of people facing prejudice and hatred, but experiencing it firsthand in a place where he had always felt welcome was something entirely different. "Ma'am," he began, his voice still steady despite the hurt he felt inside. "I'm not sure what I've done to upset you, but—" "What you've done," she interrupted, her voice now loud enough for everyone in the coffee shop to hear clearly. "What you've done is take up space in my country where you don't belong." The customers around them shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, unable to watch what was happening. Others stared in shock, unable to believe what they were witnessing in their neighborhood coffee shop. The woman wasn't finished. She had crossed a line now, and something seemed to have unleashed years of pent-up resentment and ignorance. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you belong instead of making things difficult for real Americans?" The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Every person in that coffee shop felt the weight of them. Some customers gasped audibly, others looked horrified. A few pulled out their phones, though whether to call for help or to record what was happening, it wasn't clear. James stood there, absorbing the full impact of what had just been said to him, in public, in his regular coffee shop, by a stranger who knew nothing about him except the color of his skin. Alex, the barista, looked like he wanted to say something, but seemed frozen by the shock of the situation. The other workers behind the counter had stopped what they were doing entirely. The entire rhythm of the coffee shop had come to a complete halt. James felt every emotion that a person could feel in such a moment. Anger, hurt, disappointment, sadness, and even a strange kind of pity for someone who could carry so much hatred in their heart. But more than anything, he felt the weight of responsibility. He knew that how he responded in the next few seconds would matter not just for him but for everyone watching. The college students who might learn something about dignity under pressure. The business people who might reconsider their own assumptions about others. Even the woman herself, who might be reached by a response she wasn't expecting. Every eye in the coffee shop was on him now. The silence stretched on, pregnant with possibility. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his education, his experience, and his values, all converging in this one crucial moment. What happened next would surprise everyone in that coffee shop, including the woman who had just told him to go back to Africa, because James was about to do something that none of them expected, something that would transform this moment of hatred into something entirely different. The silence in the coffee shop stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Everyone waited to see how James would respond to such a shocking and hurtful attack. Some expected him to walk away. Others thought he might respond with anger. A few wondered if he would call for the manager or ask someone to remove the woman from the store. But James did none of these things. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath and turned to face the woman completely. His movement was calm and measured, without any hint of aggression or retreat. He looked directly into her eyes with a gaze that was steady and thoughtful, as if he was considering something important. "Thank you for that suggestion," he said, his voice clear and audible to everyone in the coffee shop. "Africa is actually a place I know quite well." The woman blinked, clearly not expecting this response. She had probably anticipated anger, defensiveness, or embarrassment. But James's calm acknowledgement of her words seemed to catch her completely off guard. "What I don't know," James continued, maintaining eye contact, "is when your family first came to America. Would you mind sharing that with me?" The question hung in the air like a curveball that nobody saw coming. The woman's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out immediately. She seemed to be processing not just the question, but the entire unexpected direction the conversation had taken. Around them, the coffee shop remained completely silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. Before, it had been the heavy quiet of shock and discomfort. Now it was the focused attention of people who sensed they were about to witness something remarkable. What does that have to do with anything?" the woman stammered, her aggressive tone faltering for the first time. "I'm genuinely curious," James replied, his tone remaining respectful and sincere. "Family history is something I find fascinating. It's actually part of what I teach." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she was trying to determine whether James was mocking her or being serious. The sincerity in his voice seemed genuine, but she was clearly struggling to understand why he wasn't responding to her attack the way she expected. "My grandparents came from Ireland," she said finally, her voice less certain than before. "In the 1920s. But I don't see how that's relevant to you taking forever to order coffee," James nodded thoughtfully, as if he had just learned something valuable and interesting. Several customers leaned forward slightly, sensing that his response was going to be significant. "The 1920s, he repeated. "That's wonderful. So your family sought the American dream about 100 years ago. That took tremendous courage, leaving everything familiar behind to build a new life in a foreign country." The woman looked confused. This was definitely not how she had expected this confrontation to go. She had hurled her worst insult, told him to leave the country, and now he was complimenting her family's immigration story. "Yes, well," she said, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "They came here legally and worked hard to build something." "I'm sure they did," James agreed. "Immigration has always required incredible strength and determination. It's one of the most fundamentally American experiences there is." By now, everyone in the coffee shop was completely absorbed in the conversation. The baristas had stopped pretending to work and were listening intently. Customers who had been trying to mind their own business found themselves drawn into what was happening. The woman seemed to sense that James was building towards something, but she couldn't figure out what it was. His calm demeanor and respectful tone were completely disarming her aggressive approach. "Now, about your suggestion that I go back to Africa," James continued, his voice taking on a slightly different quality. It was still respectful, but there was something else there now. The tone of someone who was about to share knowledge that mattered deeply to him. "The interesting thing about that suggestion is that my family has actually been in America considerably longer than yours has." The woman's eyebrows furrowed. She opened her mouth to object, but James continued before she could speak. "My family has been contributing to this country for over 400 years, since before it was even called the United States of America." Few people in the coffee shop shifted in their seats. The college students at the corner table exchanged glances. This was clearly building towards something significant. "But you're absolutely right that I know Africa well," James said, his voice gaining strength and confidence. "I've spent years studying its history, its cultures, its contributions to human civilization. It's actually one of my areas of expertise." Woman looked increasingly uncomfortable. What had started as her moment of power and control was rapidly becoming something else entirely. "I teach African and African American history at the university," James explained, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who truly knew what he was talking about. "So when you suggest I go back to Africa, you're actually touching on something I'm quite passionate about." He paused for a moment, letting his words settle in the quiet coffee shop. When he continued, his voice carried the weight of decades of education and research. "Africa is not a country, as many people assume. It's a continent with 54 different nations, over 2,000 languages, and some of the most ancient and sophisticated civilizations in human history." The woman stood frozen, clearly realizing that she had picked a fight with someone who was far more knowledgeable than she had assumed. But James wasn't finished. The mathematical concepts that allow us to build bridges and skyscrapers? Many of them originated in ancient Africa. The surgical techniques that save lives in modern hospitals? African physicians were performing cataract surgery 1,000 years ago. The astronomical knowledge that helped humans navigate the oceans? Ancient African scholars were mapping the stars when much of Europe was still in the Dark Ages. His voice remained calm and educational, but there was no mistaking the power behind his words. This wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was the quiet authority of someone sharing knowledge. How that could change how people understood the world. The coffee shop remained completely silent, but now it was the silence of people who were learning something profound. James had transformed a moment of hatred into an opportunity for education, and everyone present could feel the shift in the room's energy. The woman stared at him. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She had expected to embarrass and diminish him, but instead found herself on the receiving end of a history lesson that made her look small and ignorant by comparison. James could see the impact his words were having, not just on the woman who had confronted him, but on everyone in the coffee shop. He had their complete attention now, and he realized this was one of those rare moments when education could reach beyond the classroom and touch people in a real and immediate way. "You mentioned my family needing to go back where we came from," he continued, his voice maintaining that perfect balance of respect and authority. "But here's what makes that suggestion particularly interesting from a historical perspective." He shifted slightly, his posture relaxed but confident, like a professor who had found the perfect teaching moment. "My ancestors didn't choose to come to America the way your grandparents did. They were brought here against their will, sold as property, and forced to build much of the early infrastructure of this country without compensation." The woman's face had gone pale. Around the coffee shop, people leaned in closer, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The White House where our presidents live, built largely by enslaved African Americans. The Capitol building where our laws are made. Same thing, the economic foundation that allowed America to become a world power, built on the unpaid labor of people who looked like me. James's voice carried no bitterness, just the steady presentation of historical facts. This wasn't an angry lecture. It was education delivered with the kind of passion that made complex topics understandable and memorable. "But here's the remarkable part," he continued. "Despite being treated as less than human for centuries, despite being denied education, despite facing discrimination even after slavery ended, African Americans continued to contribute to this country in extraordinary ways." He looked around the coffee shop, making eye contact with various customers who were hanging on his every word. "The traffic light system that keeps us safe on the roads? Invented by an African American named Garrett Morgan. The blood bank system that saves millions of lives? Developed by Dr. Charles Drew, an African American physician. The mathematical calculations that put Americans on the moon? Performed by brilliant African American women like Katherine Johnson." A young woman at one of the tables pulled out her phone, not to record, but to take notes. She didn't want to forget these names and contributions she had never learned about in school. Jazz music, which the world recognizes as America's greatest cultural export, created by African Americans. The Harlem Renaissance that produced some of our greatest literature, African American writers, poets, and artists. The civil rights movement that expanded freedom for all Americans, led by African Americans who believed this country could live up to its ideals. The woman who had started this confrontation looked like she wanted to disappear, but James wasn't trying to humiliate her. He was trying to educate everyone in the room, including her. Every major American war has included African American soldiers fighting for a country that didn't always treat them as equals, he continued. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, both world wars, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. African Americans have shed their blood defending American freedom for over 2 centuries. He paused to let that sink in, then continued with renewed energy. "And regarding Africa, which you suggested I should return to, let me share some things that might surprise you. The ancient kingdom of Kush conquered Egypt and ruled for nearly a century. The universities of Timbuktu were centers of learning when much of Europe couldn't read. Ethiopian physicians were performing sophisticated surgeries when European medicine still relied on bloodletting. The baristas behind the counter had completely stopped working now. Alex, who had served James hundreds of times, had never known the depth of knowledge and experience that his regular customer carried with him every day. The Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe built massive stone structures without mortar that still stand today. The Benin Empire created bronze sculptures so sophisticated that when Europeans first saw them, they couldn't believe Africans had made them. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge preserved in ancient African texts contributed to the scientific revolution that built the modern world. James's voice grew more passionate as he shared knowledge that clearly meant everything to him. So when you tell me to go back to Africa, you're actually asking me to leave behind the country my ancestors helped build and return to a continent that gave the world mathematics, medicine, astronomy, art, and philosophy thousands of years before Columbus ever set sail. The silence in the coffee shop was now complete and profound. Even the sound of traffic outside seemed muted. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something historic, not just a response to racism, but a masterclass in dignity, education, and the power of knowledge to transform ignorance. But here's what's most important, James said, his voice softening slightly. I don't want to go anywhere. This is my home. My family built this country just as much as anyone else's family did. We've earned our place here through 4 centuries of contributions, sacrifice, and unwavering faith in American ideals. He looked directly at the woman again, his eyes kind but firm. And I believe this country is big enough and strong enough for all of us. Your family from Ireland, my family from Africa, and families from every corner of the world who come here seeking the same thing, the opportunity to build something better for their children. The woman stood speechless, her earlier anger completely deflated. She looked around the coffee shop and saw faces that reflected a range of emotions: admiration, respect, and perhaps some embarrassment that they had witnessed such ignorance being displayed in their community. The question isn't whether I belong in America, James concluded. The question is whether America will live up to the promise that there's room here for everyone who's willing to contribute, to learn, and to treat their neighbors with basic human dignity. As his words settled over the coffee shop, people began to realize that they had just experienced something they would remember for the rest of their lives. This wasn't just one man defending himself against racism. It was a profound lesson in history, dignity, and the power of education to overcome hatred. The profound silence that followed James's words seemed to stretch on forever. Every person in the coffee shop was processing what they had just heard. Not just the historical facts, but the incredible grace with which this man had responded to such hateful treatment. Then James did something that no one expected. He reached into his worn leather bag and pulled out a simple business card. His movements were calm and deliberate, without any hint of triumph or smugness. He held the card out toward the woman who had confronted him. I teach African and American history at the university, he said gently. If you're genuinely interested in learning more about Africa, or about how all of our families came to contribute to this country, you're welcome to audit one of my classes. The woman stared at the card as if it were a foreign object. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached out, unsure whether to take it or not. The entire coffee shop watched this small gesture that seemed to carry enormous weight. Education, James continued, has a remarkable ability to cure ignorance, and I truly believe that everyone deserves the opportunity to learn and grow. The woman finally took the card, looking at it with confusion and what might have been the beginning of shame. Dr. James Washington, professor of history, it read, along with his office number and email address. Professor? She whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded kindly. For over 15 years now, I love teaching because every day I get to watch people discover things that change how they see the world. That's when something beautiful began to happen. A young man sitting at a nearby table started to clap. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a simple, respectful acknowledgement of what he had witnessed. Then a woman at another table joined in. Soon the sound of applause filled the coffee shop, growing stronger as more and more people expressed their admiration for how James had handled this situation. The applause wasn't just for his knowledge or his eloquence. It was for his dignity, his refusal to respond to hatred with hatred, and his incredible ability to turn a moment of ugliness into an opportunity for education and understanding. Alex, the barista, was among those clapping, his face showing a new level of respect for the regular customer he had served so many times without really knowing who he was. The other workers behind the counter joined in, and soon every person in the coffee shop was participating in this spontaneous show of support. The woman holding James's business card looked around at all the faces, seeing clearly how her behavior had been received by the community. The contrast between her actions and James's response could not have been more stark. She had brought hatred into a peaceful space, and he had responded with education and grace.